At the upscale Mother's Day dinner, my parents insisted I pay for my sister Chloe, proudly rubbed her slightly swollen belly, announcing her second baby was on the way. My mother, Patricia, clapped her hands together like a delighted child. "This is everything I have ever wanted." She beamed before her gaze snapped directly to me. Her warm smile instantly vanished, replaced by a cold and commanding expression. "You will need to move into the guest room next month," she stated. "You will help us take care of the kids." I froze, my fork hovering over my plate. I asked her what she meant by that. Chloe rolled her eyes and sighed loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "It is not like you are doing anything meaningful with your life anyway, Nia. This will finally give you a purpose instead of wasting away in that cramped little apartment of yours." Her husband Bradley, a financial broker who loved flaunting his country club membership and expensive watches, chuckled into his wineglass. I looked at the three of them, sitting there in their designer clothes, judging my quiet existence. I did not yell, I did not cry. I simply smiled, pushed my chair back, and left the restaurant without paying the bill. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Good morning, Mom. This is the Financial Crimes Unit. I am Nia, 31 years old, and somehow still healing from the financial and emotional wounds my own blood tried to inflict on me. As a highly successful business owner, I escaped their daily toxicity, but maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of duty." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how I sent my brother-in-law to a federal holding cell. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta meant keeping up appearances was the absolute most important rule in our household. But inside our pristine brick home, the emotional divide was painfully clear. My younger sister Chloe was the undeniable golden child. She was lighter, louder, and fit my mother's perfect image of a trophy daughter to show off at Sunday service. I was the quiet, darker-skinned older sister who was expected to stay in the shadows, do all the heavy lifting, and applaud her achievements. When Chloe married Bradley, a slick, white financial broker with a trust fund attitude and a habit of talking down to me, my parents treated them like absolute royalty. They always assumed I was struggling to survive. Because I kept to myself, set strict boundaries, and purposely drove a modest mid-range sedan to family events, they convinced themselves I was just a low-level office worker barely making ends meet. They had absolutely no idea that I am the founder and chief executive officer of Elite Care, a highly exclusive nanny and concierge agency servicing the ultra-wealthy across Georgia. My company generates 7 figures a year. I live in a luxury penthouse overlooking the entire city. I kept my wealth a strict secret because I knew exactly how my family operated. They viewed me not as a daughter, but as a resource to be tapped when convenient and discarded when not. The morning after that disastrous Mother's Day dinner, I was standing in my penthouse looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Atlanta skyline. The morning sun was reflecting off the glass buildings, and I was sipping my black coffee, still feeling a lingering disgust from my mother's blatant disrespect. Demanding I become a free live-in servant for Chloe was a new level of audacity, even for them. My thoughts were interrupted by my cell phone ringing on the marble kitchen island. The caller ID showed a local government number. I answered it, expecting a routine call regarding a standard business permit for my agency. "Good morning, am I speaking with Nia Carter?" The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, and highly professional. I replied that he was speaking to her. He introduced himself as Detective Vance with the Financial Crimes Unit. He stated that they were contacting me regarding a platinum credit account that had been flagged for severe fraud and delinquency. He said the account had accrued an outstanding balance of exactly $80,000 and was currently in default. I froze completely. The ceramic mug in my hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. $80,000. I pride myself on having a flawless credit score. I carry zero consumer debt. My business is highly profitable, and I pay for my personal expenses entirely in cash. I told the detective there had clearly been a mistake. I explained calmly that I do not own a platinum credit card with that specific banking institution, and I absolutely do not have $80,000 in unsecured debt. The line went quiet for a brief moment. I hear that often, Ms. Carter, the detective said. However, this account was opened 14 months ago. The applicant used your exact social security number, your exact date of birth, and your mother's maiden name to bypass all the secondary security questions. My mind started racing instantly. Identity theft. Someone had my most sensitive private information. My heart began pounding against my ribs as the severe reality of the situation set in. I asked him where the monthly statements were being sent. If a stranger stole my identity, surely they were routing the mail to a post office box or a fake commercial address to cover their tracks. The billing address on file is a residential property in the Alpharetta suburbs, the detective replied. He then read the address aloud to me. My blood ran completely cold. A physical chill washed over my entire body, starting from the back of my neck and traveling all the way down to the floor. I did not just know that exact address. I had been forced to attend miserable Thanksgiving dinners and holiday parties at that address. It was not a random hacker sitting in a basement halfway across the country. It was the exact home address of my sister Chloe and her husband Bradley. The silence stretched between me and the detective. I realized in that split second that Bradley, the hotshot financial broker, who constantly bragged about his high-rolling lifestyle and expensive watches, was secretly drowning in massive debt. And instead of downgrading his luxury cars or giving up his country club status, he decided to steal my identity. He stole his black sister-in-law's social security number to fund his fake lifestyle, and my mother and sister either knew about it or were actively enjoying the spoils of his federal crime. They thought I was a nobody. They thought I was too poor and too uneducated to ever run a credit check or fight back. They truly believed they could ruin my financial future forever, and I would simply accept it as my duty to the family. Detective Vance asked if I was still on the line. I took a deep breath, looking back out at the beautiful Atlanta skyline. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. Yes, detective, I replied. I know exactly who lives at that address. I hung up the phone with Detective Vance and placed it gently on the marble counter. My mind was sharp, calculating every single move my sister and her husband had made. Before I could even process the absolute betrayal, the intercom system on my wall chimed loudly. It was Thomas, the head concierge, working the front desk of my building. He sounded stressed. He told me that my mother and sister were downstairs in the valet circle, refusing to move their vehicle and demanding that I come down immediately. They had a screaming toddler with them, and they were threatening to cause a scene in the lobby if I did not appear. My family has always assumed I rent a tiny, cramped studio apartment somewhere on the lower floors of this building. They never once asked for a tour, and I never offered one. They had no idea I owned the sprawling penthouse crowning the very top. I grabbed my keys, slipped on my designer jacket, and took the private elevator down to the ground floor. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp Atlanta morning air, the tension was immediate. The camera of my life felt like it suddenly zoomed in, creating a suffocating claustrophobic atmosphere the moment my mother laid eyes on me. Parked aggressively in the VIP valet drop-off zone was Bradley's massive black luxury SUV. The hazard lights were flashing, completely blocking the entrance and annoying the building staff. Chloe was leaning against the passenger door, scrolling on her phone, looking completely unbothered. My mother, Patricia, was pacing near the trunk. As soon as she saw me, her face twisted into a scowl of pure irritation. She did not say good morning. She did not ask how I was doing. Instead, she reached into the back seat, unbuckled my 2-year-old nephew Mason, and practically dragged him out of the car. He was crying loudly, his face sticky with juice, clearly exhausted and fussy. Without a single word of greeting, my mother marched up to me and forcefully shoved the crying toddler into my arms. Chloe casually tossed a cheap, battered diaper bag onto the pristine pavement right at my feet. "We are going to the spa," Chloe announced, not even bothering to look up from her phone screen. "Bradley booked us a mother-daughter massage package. You need to watch Mason until we get back tonight. Consider this practice for when you move into the guest room next month. I stood there on the sidewalk holding my squirming nephew. I looked at my sister dressed in her expensive athleisure wear, acting like a wealthy stay-at-home mother. I looked at my mother holding her designer handbag with a look of extreme entitlement. These two women were standing right in front of me, casually talking about a luxury spa day, completely unaware that I had just spent the last 20 minutes talking to a federal financial crimes detective about an $80,000 debt they helped rack up in my name. The sheer audacity was almost physically suffocating. They truly viewed me as nothing more than a piece of property, a convenient babysitter they could summon on demand. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw a tantrum. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, my expression completely void of any emotion. Then I turned around, walked the 3 steps back to the black SUV, opened the heavy rear door, and firmly placed Mason right back into his leather car seat. I buckled him in safely and shut the door with a loud, heavy thud. My mother's jaw dropped. Chloe finally looked up from her phone, her eyes wide with shock. "What do you think you are doing?" my mother demanded, her voice rising in pitch, drawing the attention of the valet staff. "I told you we have appointments to get to." I stepped over the discarded diaper bag and looked at them both. "I am not your nanny," I said quietly. "And I am certainly not your fool. Enjoy your spa day." I turned my back to walk back into the lobby. I did not even make it 2 steps before I felt a violent yank on my shoulder. My mother spun me around, her face flushed with absolute rage. Before I could even react, she raised her hand and slapped me hard right across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the valet circle. The doorman gasped, stepping forward to intervene, but I held up my hand to stop him. My cheek burned, but I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. "You are a selfish, bitter disgrace to this family," my mother hissed, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "You are jealous of your sister because she has a real life and a real man, while you have absolutely nothing. You will die alone in this cheap little building, Nia." She expected me to cry. She expected me to break down, apologize, and beg for her forgiveness, just like I always did when I was a teenager. But I was not a scared little girl anymore. I was a chief executive officer. I was a millionaire. And I was the only person standing between her golden child and a federal prison sentence. I calmly raised my hand and brushed an invisible speck of dust off the lapel of my jacket. I looked at her, then looked at Chloe, who was suddenly looking a little nervous. "Drive safe," I said, my voice dangerously calm. My mother scoffed in disgust, turning on her heel and storming back to the passenger side of the SUV. Chloe quickly scrambled into the driver's seat, slamming the doors shut. I stood perfectly still on the sidewalk, watching the heavy black vehicle speed away from the curb and merge into the morning traffic. The stinging sensation on my cheek was already fading. In its place was a rushing wave of pure, unadulterated clarity. They had drawn the battle lines right here on the pavement. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and unlocked the screen. I did not call my mother to apologize. I did not call my sister to argue. I dialed the direct private number of my corporate legal team. The phone rang twice before my lead attorney answered. "Good morning, Nia," he said. "What do you need?" I kept my eyes locked on the exact spot where their car had just disappeared. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smirk that no one in my family had ever lived to see. "I need you to run a full financial background investigation on my brother-in-law Bradley," I instructed, my voice echoing with quiet authority. "Pull every deed, every loan, and every piece of credit tied to his name, and draft a federal lawsuit for identity theft. We are taking everything they own." Less than an hour after hanging up that call, my private driver pulled up to the curb of a towering glass and steel high-rise in the heart of the downtown financial district. I stepped out of the black town car, buttoning my tailored blazer as the crisp morning wind whipped past me. As I walked through the revolving glass doors and into the expansive marble lobby, the atmosphere around me shifted completely. I was no longer the disappointing daughter or the convenient scapegoat my family expected me to be. The building security guards immediately stood taller, nodding respectfully and tapping their earpieces as I bypassed the crowded main reception desk. I swiped my platinum keycard at the VIP elevator bank, stepping inside the private car alone. The doors slid shut and the elevator shot up to the top floor. When the metal doors parted, they revealed a sprawling sunlit suite of offices buzzing with quiet, focused activity. The massive frosted glass wall in the reception area proudly displayed the silver crest of my company, Elite Care. As I strode down the polished hardwood hallway, my staff quickly stepped aside, greeting me with a chorus of respectful good mornings. I nodded briefly to my employees, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor in a steady cadence of authority. I walked straight into my expansive corner office, dropping my designer bag onto the massive mahogany desk. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me, the entire city of Atlanta stretched out like a map. I barely had time to sit down before my director of security knocked on the open door. His name was Harrison, a sharp-eyed former intelligence officer, who I paid a very handsome salary to protect my high-net-worth clients from stalkers, fraudsters, and extortionists. Today, however, his target was my own brother-in-law. He stepped inside and securely closed the heavy oak door behind him. I did not waste any time with pleasantries. I handed Harrison a written slip of paper with Bradley's full legal name, his supposed corporate business address, and the suburban home address where my fraudulent credit card statements were currently being mailed. I told Harrison I needed a deep dive completely off the books and extremely quiet. I wanted every single financial footprint Bradley had left over the past 5 years. I told him to pull the mortgage records, the car leases, his brokerage commission reports, and his country club payment history. I explained the conversation I just had with the financial crimes detective regarding the $80,000 in stolen credit. Harrison did not look surprised. In our line of work, we saw high society fraud every single day. He simply nodded, pocketed the paper, and promised to have a preliminary dossier on my desk by the afternoon. 4 hours later, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across my office floor when Harrison finally returned. He placed a thick, heavy manila folder squarely in the center of my desk. His expression was dangerously grim. He sat down in the leather chair opposite me and plainly stated that the situation was much worse than an $80,000 credit card bill. I opened the folder and began scanning the highlighted documents. The truth staring back at me was absolutely shocking. Bradley was not just living slightly beyond his means. He was completely broke, standing on the edge of total financial ruin. His boutique financial brokerage firm had quietly suspended his trading license 2 months ago, pending a massive internal investigation for embezzling client funds. To keep up appearances for his wealthy friends and my blindly trusting family, he had leveraged everything he touched. The luxury black SUV Chloe had been driving that morning was 3 months behind on payments and scheduled for immediate repossession. Their sprawling suburban house had a secondary high-interest mortgage attached to it that they were defaulting on. But the most sickening part of the dossier was the extensive identity theft. Bradley had used my clean credit profile and my social security number to take out multiple predatory loans to keep his sinking ship afloat. Because my family thought I was a poor, uneducated desk worker, Bradley assumed I would never have a reason to check my credit report. He had forged my signature on high-interest payday loans, opened 5 different revolving credit lines, and even used my stolen identity as collateral to secure a private personal loan from a shady offshore lender. He was literally building his fake empire on my back. He had signed my financial death warrant just so he could keep playing golf on the weekends and buying expensive bags for my sister. I sat back in my chair staring at the undeniable proof of his federal crimes. My family, completely blinded by his white privilege and his expensive suits, treated him like royalty while treating me like dirt on their shoes. Harrison asked if I wanted him to forward the entire file directly to the federal authorities and trigger an immediate arrest. I shook my head slowly, closing the folder and resting my hands flat on top of it. I told him not yet. I wanted to build an airtight case. I wanted to trap them so perfectly that they would never be able to spin the narrative or play the victim. I wanted to watch them fall from the highest possible pedestal. Right at that exact moment, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the wood of my desk. The caller ID flashed with a picture of my father, Marcus. He rarely called me during the workday unless he wanted to demand a favor. I signaled for Harrison to leave the room, took a deep, steadying breath, and answered the call. My father did not even bother saying hello. His voice boomed through the phone speaker, heavy with patriarchal authority and barely contained rage. "Your mother just came home in tears," he barked. "I heard exactly what you did this morning down at your apartment building. Refusing to help your pregnant sister and disrespecting your mother in public is a total disgrace to this family. You are acting exactly like a bitter, jealous woman." I remained completely silent, letting him rant. "You are going to attend Sunday service with us this weekend," my father commanded. "And when church is over, you are going to stand in front of the entire congregation and publicly apologize to Chloe and your mother for your selfish outburst. If you do not show up, I am calling my estate lawyer on Monday morning. I will completely cut you out of my will, and you will never see a single dime of your grandmother's property." I did not raise my voice in response to his screaming. I simply took a breath and told him that this was not a conversation we were going to have over the phone. I suggested we meet for a late lunch immediately at his favorite upscale steakhouse downtown, a place where he loved to play the role of the wealthy patriarch. He huffed a breath of arrogant approval, muttered a sharp agreement, and hung up the phone. I left the devastating dossier sitting right there on my desk, locked my office door, and instructed my driver to take me to the restaurant. When I arrived, my father was already seated at a heavy mahogany booth in the back corner of the dimly lit dining room. He was nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, wearing a tailored suit that projected an image of immense success. As I slid into the leather seat across from him, the atmosphere between us was instantly suffocating. I focused entirely on his face, studying the deep manipulative lines around his eyes. His gaze was cold and calculating, the look of a man who viewed his family members not as human beings, but as strategic assets to be managed and controlled. He did not bother asking how my day was going. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the crisp white tablecloth, and immediately launched into his lecture. He told me that my behavior that morning was a massive embarrassment to the family name. He said Patricia was at home weeping because she felt she had raised a bitter, ungrateful daughter. He looked me dead in the eye and stated that Chloe was the future of our family lineage. She had secured a highly successful white husband, she was raising a beautiful grandson, and she was currently carrying another child. According to him, she was doing everything right. Then he turned his sights entirely on me. He narrowed his eyes, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. He told me that my life had absolutely no trajectory. In his mind, I was just a lonely, aging woman working a dead-end desk job, living in a cheap rental and contributing absolutely nothing of value to our family legacy. He said that moving into Chloe's guest room and acting as her live-in nanny was the only way I could finally make myself useful. When I remained completely silent, he played his ultimate trump card. He brought up Grandma Dorothy. My grandmother was the only person in this family who ever showed me genuine, unconditional love. Before she passed away, she owned a massive historic estate in one of the most coveted neighborhoods in Atlanta. The property was completely paid off and currently valued at over $1.5 million. In her original wishes, she wanted the house to be split evenly between Chloe and me. But my father was the sole executor of her estate, holding full legal power of attorney. He took a slow sip of his bourbon and weaponized the concept of generational wealth. He gave me an entire lecture on how wealth is built and preserved by families who stick together and follow the natural hierarchy. He said he was the gatekeeper of that wealth. He explicitly threatened that if I did not pack up my apartment, surrender my independence, and dedicate my life to serving my sister, he would permanently disinherit me. He promised to rewrite the estate documents and leave the entire $1.5 million property solely to Chloe and Bradley. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of his speech was almost too much to endure. He was sitting across from me preaching about building financial empires and preserving generational wealth, while blindly worshipping a fraudulent son-in-law who was actively bankrupting their family. My father thought he was holding a gun to my head. He thought the threat of losing my grandmother's inheritance would break my spirit and force me to my knees. He had absolutely no idea that I was a self-made millionaire sitting on a corporate empire of my own. He also had no idea that I already possessed the exact legal documents necessary to send his beloved son-in-law to a federal penitentiary. I looked at his smug, self-satisfied eyes. I realized right then that trying to reason with a narcissist was a complete waste of breath. If I argued, he would simply dig his heels in deeper. To catch a predator, you have to play the role of the prey. I let my shoulders slump forward deliberately, breaking eye contact to stare down at my empty hands. I forced my expression to soften into a mask of total defeat. I swallowed hard, acting as though the thought of losing my grandmother's house had completely broken my resolve. I kept my voice low and submissive. I told him he was right. I told him I did not want to lose my place in the family, and I certainly did not want to be cut out of the will. A triumphant, sickening smile spread across my father's face. The tension in his shoulders completely vanished. He leaned back against the leather booth, vastly satisfied with his own perceived power. He instructed me to be at the family church early on Sunday morning. He demanded that after the service I would stand in front of the pastor and the entire congregation to publicly apologize to Patricia and Chloe for my jealousy. After that, we would discuss my move and date to the guest room. I nodded quietly, picked up my purse, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving him to pay the bill. I spent the next 48 hours executing my plan in absolute silence. I did not return to my apartment. I stayed in my penthouse coordinating with my legal team and letting my corporate security director finalize the explosive dossier on Bradley. When Sunday morning finally arrived, the Atlanta sun was shining brightly through my floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood in front of my expansive vanity mirror, preparing for the most important performance of my entire life. I dressed meticulously. I did not wear the cheap, oversized clothes my family expected from me, but I also did not wear my most expensive designer suit. I chose a simple, elegant, dark dress that projected quiet respectability. I applied minimal makeup, pinning my hair back neatly. I looked exactly like the compliant, obedient daughter they were expecting to publicly humiliate. I walked over to my bedroom island and picked up my classic leather designer handbag. I unzipped the hidden interior pocket. I reached into my jewelry drawer and pulled out a sleek, high-grade digital audio recording device that my security team used for corporate espionage. I checked the battery level, pressed the small red button on the side until the indicator light blinked solid green, and dropped it deep into the hidden pocket of my bag. I zipped it completely shut. My family wanted to put me on trial in front of our entire community. They wanted to drag my name through the mud and force me into submission, using a church sanctuary as their courtroom. But they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was no longer the defenseless little girl they used to bully. I was walking into the lion's den, but I was bringing the fire. I grabbed my car keys, stepped onto the private elevator, and headed to church. The parking lot of our family church was already packed with luxury sedans and polished SUVs by the time I arrived. This was not just a place of worship. In our affluent community, this church was the ultimate social battleground. It was where reputations were built, destroyed, and fiercely debated over Sunday brunch. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors, feeling the immediate weight of 100 eyes tracking my movement. I took a seat in the back pew, resting my designer bag right next to me, fully aware that the digital recorder hidden inside was capturing every single whisper, every rustle of fabric, and every fake greeting. Down at the very front of the sanctuary, occupying the center row of honor, was my family. My father Marcus sat tall in his tailored suit, projecting the image of a benevolent patriarch. Next to him was my mother, Patricia, wearing an extravagant silk hat and a perfectly pressed dress, playing the role of the devoted matriarch. And right beside them sat Chloe and Bradley. Bradley had his arm draped protectively over Chloe's shoulders, acting like the perfect, loving husband and father. To the rest of the congregation, they were the absolute pinnacle of success and godly devotion. To me, they were a den of thieves dressed in Sunday best. I sat quietly through the 2-hour service. I listened to the choir sing. I listened to the pastor preach about forgiveness and family unity. I could see my father glancing back at me over his shoulder, his eyes flashing with smug anticipation. He was waiting for the service to end so the real show could begin. He was waiting for me to step forward, break down in tears, and beg for their forgiveness in front of the entire church board. When the final prayer was spoken, and the congregation began moving into the fellowship hall for coffee and refreshments, the atmosphere immediately shifted. The sanctuary emptied out, but the core members of the church, the wealthy elders, the head pastor, and the formidable church aunties all gathered in the center of the hall. The church aunties were a group of older, highly influential women who controlled the social currency of our community. If they decided you were a bad person, you were completely exiled. I stood by the doorway sipping a cup of black coffee, watching my family execute their smear campaign with terrifying precision. My mother Patricia strategically positioned herself right in the middle of the most influential church aunties. She held a tissue to her face, dabbing at her eyes, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. "I just do not know what to do about Nia anymore," my mother cried loudly, making sure her voice carried across the marble floor. "Pastor, we have tried everything to help her. We have offered her a place in our home, but she has become so dark and so bitter." The pastor, a tall man with a booming voice and a gullible heart, placed a comforting hand on my mother's shoulder. He asked her what was causing this division in the family. Chloe immediately stepped forward, rubbing her slightly swollen stomach to emphasize her pregnancy. She put on a face of absolute tragedy. "It is because I am pregnant," Chloe announced, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the hall. "Nia cannot have children of her own. The doctors told her years ago that she is completely barren. Ever since I announced my second pregnancy, she has lost her mind. She is so consumed by jealousy that she is taking her rage out on my innocent toddler. Just yesterday, she pushed my son away and threatened us in public. The sheer magnitude of the lie was breathtaking. I am not barren. I simply chose to dedicate my 20s to building a corporate empire instead of rushing into a marriage. But in this room, a woman without a husband and children was viewed as a tragic failure. Chloe took my personal choices and weaponized them into a medical tragedy to make herself look like the victim of a deranged, jealous sister. My father Marcus stood by, nodding solemnly, playing the part of the heartbroken dad. Bradley stood right behind Chloe, shaking his head in fake disbelief, playing the supportive husband. They were assassinating my character in broad daylight. They were painting me as a mentally unstable, broken, bitter woman who harbored dangerous ill will toward an unborn child. The reaction from the congregation was immediate and devastating. It was like watching a slow-motion camera pan across a room full of hostile strangers. Dozens of faces turned toward me. The church aunties glared at me with deep disgust and condescending pity. The elders shook their heads, whispering behind their hands. The judgment was so thick and heavy in the air you could almost choke on it. They were looking at me like I was a monster. My father finally stepped forward, clearing his throat loudly to command the room's attention. He looked directly at me, his eyes practically burning a hole through my calm exterior. "Nia," he boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We love you, but we will not tolerate this demonic jealousy in our family. Come forward right now. Stand before this congregation, apologize to your sister for your wicked behavior, and beg the Lord to soften your bitter heart." The entire fellowship hall went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for me to shatter. They expected me to walk forward, drop to my knees, and surrender my dignity just to keep my place in the family. My father had staged this entire public execution to break my spirit and force me to become Chloe's unpaid servant. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even defend myself against the lies. Because explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a complete waste of power. I calmly placed my coffee cup down on a nearby table. I picked up my designer bag, ensuring the hidden recorder was still capturing every single moment of their theatrical fraud. I began walking slowly across the polished marble floor. The crowd parted for me, stepping back as if my supposed bitterness was contagious. My mother lowered her tissue, a victorious smirk playing on her lips. My father stood taller, ready to receive my public surrender. Chloe looked incredibly smug, but I did not walk toward them. I walked straight past my father. I walked right past my mother and her group of whispering aunties. I walked directly up to the heavy brass offering box situated at the front of the hall. The box was used for special donations to the church's building fund. I reached inside my tailored coat and pulled out a crisp white envelope. Inside that envelope was a certified cashier's check for $10,000 drawn directly from my corporate charity account, signed anonymously. I did not need their approval, and I certainly did not need their prayers. I was buying the building they were standing in. I held the envelope over the brass slot. The room was so quiet that the sound of the thick paper slipping into the metal box echoed sharply. I let go of the envelope. It dropped into the box with a final satisfying thud. I turned around to face the room. The smugness had completely vanished from my father's face, replaced by total confusion. My mother stared at me, her fake tears completely drying up. They had no idea what I had just done, but my utter lack of submission terrified them. I looked directly at Chloe, giving her a slow, chilling smile that made her visibly take a step back behind Bradley. I did not say a single word to any of them. I simply adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, turned my back on the entire congregation, and walked straight out the heavy oak doors and into the bright Atlanta sunlight. The heavy oak doors of the church closed securely behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating whispers and judgmental stares of the congregation. The bright Atlanta sunlight washed over me, feeling like a sudden cleansing wave against my skin. I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air and began walking across the sprawling asphalt parking lot. I headed purposefully toward my modest mid-range sedan, the carefully selected decoy car I always drove to these family events to perfectly maintain my cover as a struggling low-level office worker. The gravel crunched steadily beneath my heels. I was already mentally calculating the logistics of my next corporate acquisition, completely unbothered by the theatrical display of manipulation and fake tears I had just left behind in the fellowship hall. But before I could even reach into my bag for my car keys, the peaceful silence of the parking lot was broken. I heard the heavy, aggressive thud of expensive leather dress shoes storming up the pavement directly behind me. Before I could turn around, a large, heavy hand slammed flat against the driver's side window of my car, effectively trapping me between the vehicle and his body. I turned my head slowly. It was Bradley. The polite, supportive, deeply religious husband mask he had just worn inside the sanctuary was completely gone. In its place was the arrogant, flushed face of a man who was entirely used to bullying his way through life, without ever facing a single consequence. He stood entirely too close to me, intentionally using his height and his physical frame to cast a threatening shadow over me. It was a classic, pathetic intimidation tactic. He was looking down his nose at me, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of panic and supreme entitlement. This was a man whose entire existence was deeply rooted in his absolute certainty that his white privilege and his expensive tailored suits made him completely untouchable, especially to a black woman he viewed as beneath him. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" Bradley demanded. His voice had dropped into a harsh, venomous whisper, completely devoid of the southern charm he used on my parents. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground and looked at him with an expression of complete and utter boredom. I told him I was going home, and I politely asked him to remove his hand from my vehicle. Bradley let out a sharp, condescending laugh. He leaned in closer, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp odor of nervous sweat. You think you are so smart, Nia. You think you can just walk out of there and ignore your family. But I got a notification on my phone this morning. A federal investigator from the Financial Crimes Unit pulled a hard inquiry on a platinum credit line. He stared at me, waiting for me to panic or confess. When I remained completely silent, his jaw clenched in frustration. I know it was you who triggered that investigation, he hissed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. You are making a massive mistake. You need to drop this angry, bitter woman routine right now. It is getting pathetic, and frankly, it is embarrassing for Chloe to have to explain your hostile attitude to our friends. You should be down on your knees thanking God that this family even tolerates your presence. The racial microaggressions rolled off his tongue so naturally, it was almost entirely effortless for him. He viewed my independence as hostility. He viewed my calm boundaries as anger. He had completely convinced himself that because I was a single independent woman who refused to bow down to him, I was somehow emotionally unstable. I looked at his suit. It was a designer label, but I noticed the very slight fraying at the edge of his shirt cuff. I noticed the tiny scuff on his leather shoes. These were the subtle, undeniable signs of a man who was desperately trying to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth while secretly drowning in a sea of massive debt. Bradley mistook my quiet observation for fear. He puffed his chest out further, fully leaning into his unearned superiority complex. Let me explain exactly how this is going to work, he commanded, his tone dripping with absolute authority. You are going to call those investigators back on Monday morning. You are going to tell them you made a mistake, that you opened that account yourself, and that you simply forgot about it. You are going to take the hit on your precious little credit score, and then by Friday afternoon you are going to pack your cheap little apartment into boxes and move into the guest room at our house to help my pregnant wife. I tilted my head slightly, studying him like he was a fascinating biological specimen. I asked him what would happen if I politely declined his generous offer to become his unpaid servant and his financial scapegoat. Bradley's face twisted into a truly ugly sneer. I know exactly how people like you operate, Nia. You get a tiny little entry-level desk job, you make a few $1,000s, and suddenly you think you are the chief executive officer of the entire world. But you are nothing. I play golf with the elite executives in this city. I have connections you cannot even begin to comprehend. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping into a register of pure malicious extortion. If you do not drop this absurd fraud investigation and do exactly what you are told, I will personally ruin your pathetic life. I will find out exactly who your manager is. I will call your boss, and I will tell them that you are a thief who steals from her own family. I will have you fired and blacklisted from every single corporate office in the state of Georgia before your lunch break. Good luck paying the rent on your apartment when you are entirely unemployable. The absolute delicious irony of his threat was almost too much for me to handle. This broke, fraudulent, desperate man was standing in a church parking lot threatening to call the boss of my company to get me fired. He was threatening to destroy a career that he could not even begin to fathom. He had absolutely no idea that he was threatening to call me to complain about me. But I did not let a single trace of amusement show on my face. I needed him to keep talking. I needed him to dig his grave so deep that he would never be able to climb out of it. I lowered my voice, projecting a tone of mild uncertainty. I asked him why he would do something like this to me. I asked him why he stole my social security number, if he was so incredibly wealthy and successful. My feigned weakness was exactly the fuel his massive ego needed. He scoffed, looking at me with pure disgust. Because I needed the capital Nia. And you were not using your name for anything important anyway. It is just a name. I am building a massive legacy for Chloe and my son. I deserve those funds far more than you do, sitting alone in your empty apartment. You owe us this. You are going to shut your mouth and do exactly what is best for the family. He had just explicitly confessed to federal identity theft, wire fraud, and extortion, all while standing proudly in his Sunday suit. He believed so deeply in his own invincibility that he did not even care who heard him say it. Bradley finally took a step back, satisfied that he had successfully terrified me into total submission. He adjusted the lapels of his suit jacket and smoothed down his tie. He gave me one final, patronizing smile. "Be a good girl, Nia. Make the right choice." He turned around and walked confidently across the parking lot toward the sanctuary, acting as if he was the king of the entire world. I stood perfectly still by my car, watching him disappear back into the crowd of wealthy churchgoers. I did not tremble. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I simply raised my left arm and looked down at the sleek Apple Watch strapped tightly to my wrist. The screen was dark, but right in the top corner, a tiny, solid red light was blinking steadily. The custom recording application my corporate security team had installed was running perfectly. It had captured every single racial slur. It had captured every single threat of extortion. And most importantly, it had captured a crystal clear, completely undeniable audio confession of his federal financial crimes. I tapped the screen once, saving the audio file securely to my encrypted cloud server. I unlocked my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and smiled brightly at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. Bradley wanted to play a game of corporate destruction, and I was more than happy to oblige. I drove straight from that church parking lot back to the soaring glass tower of my corporate headquarters. The contrast between the petty manipulation of my family and the quiet power of my real life was absolutely staggering. I walked past the lobby security desk, rode the private elevator up to my penthouse office, and sat down at my massive mahogany desk. I opened my MacBook, ready to forward the audio recording of Bradley's confession to my corporate legal team. But before I could even attach the secure file, my executive assistant Maya knocked lightly on the open glass door. Maya was holding a sleek black leather folder, and she looked slightly perplexed. She walked over to my desk and explained that a new application had just come through our online portal for our most exclusive tier of service. At Elite Care, our Diamond Tier package provides around-the-clock live-in professional nannies who specialize in newborn care, strict sleep training, and early childhood development. It is a premium service reserved exclusively for ultra-high net worth individuals, high-profile celebrities, and elite corporate executives. The monthly retainer for this package is exactly $15,000, and that does not even include our initial placement fees and the required background checks. Maya placed the folder down on my desk and tapped the screen of her tablet, transferring the digital file directly to my MacBook monitor. She told me that the applicants had passed the initial automated screening because they provided proof of significant liquid funds. However, our manual financial review team had just flagged something highly irregular in their payment routing details. She wanted my personal authorization before officially declining the application and refunding their initial deposit. I leaned forward, looking past Maya's shoulder to stare directly at the bright screen of my laptop. I scrolled down the digital intake form, my eyes scanning the names printed at the very top of the application. The primary applicant was listed as Chloe, proudly identifying herself as a luxury lifestyle influencer and stay-at-home mother. The secondary applicant, acting as the primary financial guarantor, was Bradley. I let out a short, completely humorless laugh. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of these two people was truly breathtaking. Less than an hour ago, Bradley had cornered me in a church parking lot, threatening to destroy my entire career if I did not pack up my apartment and become their unpaid live-in servant. He had hurled racial slurs at me, belittling my worth and demanding my complete submission. And all the while, right behind my back, he and my sister were applying to hire my luxury agency to provide them with a premium round-the-clock nanny. They wanted to force me into their home to be their personal maid and emotional punching bag, while simultaneously parading an elite care nanny around their wealthy friends as the ultimate status symbol. They had absolutely no idea that the very company they were trying to hire was entirely owned and operated by the sister they despised. But that was not even the best part. I asked Maya to show me the irregular payment details that our accounting software had flagged. I clicked on the financial tab of their application. To secure the Diamond Tier package, clients are required to submit an initial wire transfer of $30,000 to cover the first 2 months of service. Bradley had indeed submitted the wire transfer information, but the routing numbers did not belong to a personal checking account. They did not belong to a standard joint savings account, or even a legitimate corporate expense account. The funds were being drawn directly from a registered nonprofit organization called the Bright Futures Children's Charity. I immediately opened a new secure browser window and ran a deep background search on that specific charitable foundation. The results loaded in less than 3 seconds. The charity had been legally incorporated exactly 8 months ago. The listed founder and chief financial director of the nonprofit was Bradley. According to the public tax filings, the charity was supposedly dedicated to raising funds for underprivileged youth in the greater Atlanta area. I sat back in my leather chair, completely stunned by his profound stupidity. Bradley was not just stealing my identity to fund his personal lifestyle. He had actively set up a fake charity. He was soliciting generous donations from his wealthy country club friends and his trusting church congregation, funneling that tax-free money into a shell account, and then using those charitable funds to pay for his own luxury expenses. He was literally attempting to use money meant for poor children to hire a $15,000 a month nanny for his own child. This was no longer just a case of simple credit card fraud. This was federal embezzlement. This was blatant money laundering. It was wire fraud across state lines. He was committing financial felonies so severe that they carried mandatory minimum sentences in a federal penitentiary. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy him entirely. Maya stood patiently on the other side of my desk, completely unaware of my personal connection to the dangerous criminals currently displayed on my screen. She asked me if she should initiate our standard corporate fraud protocol, block their internet protocol address, and forward the routing numbers to the financial authorities. She naturally assumed I would want absolutely nothing to do with such a blatant legal liability. I looked back at the screen, reading Chloe's arrogant, demanding notes in the special requests section of the application. She had explicitly demanded a nanny who was quiet, submissive, and willing to work extended hours without complaint. She wanted someone she could easily control and demean. I slowly closed the financial tab and looked up at Maya. A cold, calculated smile spread across my face. I told her not to decline the application. I told her not to report the routing numbers and to temporarily override the security flag in our accounting software. Maya looked incredibly confused, but she was far too professional to question a direct order from her chief executive officer. She nodded slowly, asking me how exactly I wanted to proceed with these clients. I instructed her to draft a formal email of acceptance on behalf of Elite Care. I told her to congratulate Chloe and Bradley on being specially selected for our exclusive Diamond Tier program. I wanted them to feel incredibly special. I wanted them to feel like they had successfully scammed the system and won the ultimate prize. I wanted their egos inflated to the absolute maximum capacity so the fall would absolutely devastate them. Then I gave Maya the final crucial instruction. I told her that Elite Care policy requires a final in-person consultation and contract signing with our executive leadership for all Diamond Tier placements. I instructed her to schedule this final interview for this upcoming Saturday afternoon at exactly 2:00. Maya typed the notes into her tablet, confirming the time. She asked me if she should invite them into our corporate headquarters for the formal signing. I shook my head. I told her we would be providing a white glove on-site service for this particular client. I gave her the address of the exclusive suburban country club where my sister was hosting her massive, overly expensive baby shower. I knew for a fact that my mother, my father, and every single one of Chloe's wealthy friends would be in attendance at that exact time. I personally approved the application with a single click of my mouse. I had the audio recording. I had the identity theft documents. And now I had undeniable documented proof of their federal charity fraud. The trap was perfectly set, and the heavy iron jaws were about to snap shut on the best day of their miserable lives. 2 days after I approved their fraudulent nanny application from my corporate office, my parents hosted a mandatory family cookout at their suburban home. It was meant to be a casual celebration leading up to Chloe's lavish baby shower that weekend, but in my family, a cookout was never just about sharing food. It was a carefully orchestrated social event designed to display wealth, reinforce the family hierarchy, and publicly punish anyone who stepped out of line. I parked my modest decoy sedan at the very end of the long driveway, took a deep breath, and walked around to the sprawling backyard. Walking onto the patio felt exactly like stepping into a hostile arena. The air was incredibly thick, with the smell of hickory wood smoke and roasting barbecue, but the heavy atmosphere of judgment was even stronger. Conversations seemed to abruptly pause the second I walked past. I could see the rapid shift in body language across the yard. Groups of aunts leaning in to whisper behind their plastic cups, older cousins raising their eyebrows and shaking their heads as they looked at me. My mother and sister had clearly spent the entire week calling every single relative to spread their twisted narrative about my supposed jealousy and barrenness. I was officially the black sheep, completely isolated in a sea of my own blood relatives. Before I could even set down the dessert, I had brought my mother. Patricia marched right up to me. She was wearing a pristine white linen outfit, looking every bit the wealthy suburban hostess. She did not say hello. She did not thank me for coming. She simply grabbed a pair of metal tongs, shoved them into my hand, and pointed sharply toward the massive grill, smoking at the edge of the lawn. "You are late," my mother snapped loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Put your purse inside and start serving the plates. Your uncle is tired of standing by the fire, and we have guests who need their drinks refilled. Do not just stand around acting like a guest. Make yourself useful for once." I looked across the manicured lawn. While I was being ordered to sweat over a hot grill and serve paper plates like a hired caterer, Chloe was holding court on the other side of the yard. She was lounging on a premium cushioned outdoor sofa under a large, expensive shaded canopy. Her feet were propped up on a matching ottoman. Several younger cousins were literally hovering around her, fetching her fresh fruit and refilling her iced mocktail. Bradley stood right behind her, laughing loudly with the uncles sitting at the folding table, playing spades, acting like the undisputed king of the family. I did not argue with my mother. I simply took the metal tongs, set my designer bag securely inside the house, and walked over to the grill. I spent the next hour serving perfectly glazed ribs, potato salad, and baked beans to relatives who barely even looked me in the eye. I filled cups with ice. I wiped down tables. I played the role of the silent, obedient servant they all desperately wanted me to be. I swallowed my pride because I knew that every single plate I served was just another nail in their collective coffin. Eventually, my duties required me to carry a fresh pitcher of iced tea over to the shaded canopy where Chloe was holding her audience captive. As I approached, Chloe saw me coming and intentionally raised her voice, making sure I would hear every single word she said. "Yes, Bradley and I finally finalized the childcare arrangements," Chloe announced loudly to a group of highly impressed aunts and cousins. "We decided we simply cannot trust just anyone with our children, so we hired Elite Care. They are the absolute most exclusive agency in the entire state of Georgia." A loud chorus of impressed gasps and congratulatory murmurs rose from the women sitting around her. One of my cousins asked how much a service like that cost. Chloe let out a smug theatrical sigh, adjusting her diamond rings. "Well, the diamond tier package we selected is $15,000 a month. But honestly, peace of mind is absolutely priceless. They are sending their top executive team to my baby shower this Saturday to personally sign the final contracts with us. It is a very exclusive white glove service. They do not just accept anyone with a checkbook." She paused, turning her head to look directly at me as I poured a glass of iced tea for the aunt sitting next to her. Chloe gave me a sickeningly sweet smile filled with pure venom. "Nia, I am so sorry we could not let you move in and be the nanny, Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. But Bradley and I realized we needed a real professional. You know, someone with actual child development credentials and a sophisticated background. But I heard Elite Care is expanding their corporate offices. Maybe you could apply to be one of their janitors. I am sure sweeping floors for a luxury company pays much better than whatever little desk job you are doing right now. The entire canopy fell dead silent. A few of my cousins awkwardly looked down at their laps, while my mother's friends openly smirked at the brutal insult. Chloe was publicly mocking my supposed poverty, using the very company I built from the ground up as a weapon to humiliate me. I finished pouring the iced tea, set the heavy glass pitcher down on the table, and looked Chloe directly in the eyes. I did not glare. I did not show an ounce of anger. I gave her a bright, completely serene smile. I am absolutely certain that Elite Care will give you exactly the level of service you deserve, Chloe. I said the words slowly, letting the double meaning hang in the humid air. I hope your final interview on Saturday is an unforgettable experience. Chloe frowned slightly, clearly confused by my lack of outrage, but I did not give her a chance to respond. I turned around and walked back across the lawn toward the house. I needed to get away from the suffocating arrogance before I burst out laughing. I stepped through the sliding glass doors and into the cool, air-conditioned quiet of the kitchen. The room was mostly empty, save for the massive spread of leftover food on the granite counters. I walked over to the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. As I closed the stainless steel door, I noticed my Aunt Shirley sitting alone at the small breakfast nook in the corner. Aunt Shirley was my father's older sister. She was notoriously bitter, highly observant, and entirely unpredictable. She was also currently drinking straight from a silver flask she kept hidden in her oversized purse. She had never liked my mother, Patricia, often referring to her as a social climbing parasite. Shirley watched me unscrew the cap of my water bottle. She let out a dry, raspy chuckle. "You are taking an awful lot of abuse out there today, Nia." She noted, her words slurring just a tiny bit from the liquor. "Patricia has them all convinced you are the devil incarnate." I leaned against the kitchen counter and took a sip of water. "Let them talk, Aunt Shirley. Words do not pay the bills." Shirley took another long swig from her flask, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the backyard window. "Your daddy is out there playing the wealthy patriarch, barking orders and acting like he owns the entire world. I heard him threatening to take your name off Dorothy's house if you did not submit to that spoiled little brat of a sister." I nodded slowly, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "Yes, he reminded me quite clearly that he controls the generational wealth in this family. He told me the house belongs to him." Aunt Shirley suddenly slammed her flask down on the wooden table. A loud, bitter laugh erupted from her chest. "Generational wealth. What a massive, pathetic joke. Marcus does not have a pot to pee in, and he certainly does not own a single brick of my mother's house." I froze. The bottle of water in my hand stopped halfway to my mouth. I slowly lowered it, staring at my aunt. I asked her exactly what she meant by that. Shirley leaned forward, her eyes wide with the desperate need to spill a long-held secret. She lowered her voice into a harsh, conspiratorial whisper. "3 years ago, when your precious sister Chloe demanded that massive $100,000 fairy tale wedding, your father did not have the cash. He and Patricia were completely broke from trying to keep up appearances at that country club. So Marcus used his power of attorney. He went behind the entire family's back and took out a massive second mortgage on Dorothy's house." The blood roared in my ears. I stepped closer to the table, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "He pulled every single drop of equity out of that historic property." Shirley continued, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "They spent your grandmother's entire legacy on flower arrangements, imported champagne, and a down payment on Bradley's luxury car to make him look like a success. They have been drowning in those high-interest mortgage payments ever since. That house does not belong to your father, Nia. It belongs to the bank. And from what I heard, the bank is getting ready to take it back." The entire kitchen seemed to spin for a fraction of a second as the pieces of the puzzle aggressively locked into place. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. My father had sat across from me in that expensive steakhouse, threatening to disinherit me from a property he did not even own anymore. My parents were completely bankrupt. They were faking their wealth, just like Bradley was faking his. The entire family was built on a crumbling mountain of massive toxic debt, and they were trying to use my clean credit and my unpaid labor as the final life raft to save themselves from drowning. I looked out the kitchen window at my father, who was standing on the patio laughing proudly, completely unaware that his sister had just handed me the master key to his absolute destruction. I stepped out of the kitchen and walked back onto the patio. The world around me suddenly looked entirely different. My father was no longer a towering wealthy patriarch in my eyes. He was just a desperate broke man standing on a sinking ship, trying to figure out which one of his daughters he could throw overboard to keep himself afloat. I did not even make it to the edge of the lawn before he called my name, his voice booming over the chatter of the relatives. He ordered me to follow him inside to his private home office. I followed him down the hallway, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind us. The atmosphere in the room immediately felt distorted and suffocating, as if the entire foundation of the house was tilted dangerously off its axis. He took his seat behind his massive desk, trying to project total control, but I could see the faint sheen of nervous sweat reflecting on his forehead. A moment later, the door opened again, and my mother walked in, followed closely by Chloe. They stood flanking my father's desk like prison guards, boxing me into the center of the room. My father cleared his throat and opened a leather folder. He looked at me with a sickeningly benevolent smile. He told me that he had spent the last 2 days praying about our conversation at the steakhouse. He said he realized that family was the absolute most important thing in the world, and he wanted to make things right between us. He reached into the folder and slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood toward me. He announced that he was finally ready to honor my grandmother's original wishes. He was officially going to add my name to the deed of the historic family estate. He spoke as if he was handing me a priceless crown jewel, acting like the most generous man on earth. But I knew the truth. I looked down at the documents. I did not need my corporate lawyers to translate the bold print at the very top of the page. It was a joint borrower agreement for a massive consolidated personal loan. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the desk. He kept his voice smooth and highly persuasive. He explained that in exchange for securing my rightful place on the family deed, I just needed to do my part to help support the family legacy. He said that with Chloe's second baby on the way and Bradley's business undergoing a temporary financial restructuring, the family needed a quick injection of liquid capital. He was demanding that I sign a personal promissory note for exactly $100,000 using my pristine credit score and my clean financial history as the sole guarantee. The sheer absolute depravity of his plan was almost hard to comprehend. He was not giving me an inheritance. He was trying to handcuff me to a sinking anchor. He knew the house was already severely underwater and weeks away from total foreclosure by the bank. He was trying to trick me into legally attaching my name to his toxic debt. If I signed that paper, the bank would not just take the house. They would come directly after my bank accounts, my future wages, and my corporate assets to settle the $100,000 deficit. He was literally trying to bankrupt his own daughter just to save his own skin for a few more months. I picked up the heavy packet of paper. I did not say a word. I just read through the legally binding paragraphs, acting as though I was carefully considering his generous offer. My silence made them incredibly impatient. My mother crossed her arms, tapping her foot against the floor. "Come on, Nia." She pressured, her voice tight with mounting anxiety. "This is a massive opportunity for you. Your father is being incredibly generous by letting you share in this property. The least you can do is help your sister during this beautiful time in her life. We are a family. We share our resources." I looked up from the paper and stared directly at Chloe. She was leaning against the bookshelf, playing with her expensive diamond necklace. She looked completely annoyed that she even had to be in the room with me. I asked Chloe if she really thought it was fair for me to take on a massive high-interest loan just so she could continue to live in a luxury house and hire expensive nannies while her husband was secretly going broke. Chloe rolled her eyes dramatically and let out a harsh, condescending laugh. Oh, please, Nia, stop acting like you are making some massive sacrifice for us. You live in a tiny, depressing apartment. You drive a cheap car. You barely spend any money at all. What else are you going to do with your credit score? You do not have a husband. You do not have kids anyway. It is not like you can take the money to the grave with you. You owe this family for putting a roof over your head when you were growing up. Just sign the stupid paper so we can get back to the party. Her words hung in the distorted, heavy air of the office. She was reducing my entire existence to a blank check for her convenience. They truly believed I was nothing but an empty vessel, entirely devoid of a future, completely unworthy of keeping the money I had worked my entire life to earn. They did not care if I ended up on the street as long as Chloe could keep pretending to be wealthy. My father held out an expensive silver pen, gesturing impatiently for me to take it. Sign the documents, Nia, he commanded, dropping the nice guy routine entirely. His voice was hard and threatening. Your name goes on the house, the money goes to your sister, and we can finally put all this jealousy behind us. Do it now, or you can pack your bags and never speak to us again. I looked at the silver pen trembling slightly in his hand. I looked at my father's desperate, greedy eyes. I looked at my mother's fake, anxious smile, and I looked at my sister's sneering, utterly entitled face. They were standing in a house they did not own, trying to steal money they had not earned from a woman they did not even know. I did not take the pen. Instead, I placed my hands firmly on both sides of the thick legal packet. I looked my father dead in the eye, and with one swift, deliberate motion, I tore the entire stack of documents straight down the middle. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed sharply in the quiet office. My mother let out a loud gasp of absolute horror, her hand flying to her mouth. My father shot up from his leather chair, his face instantly turning a deep, violent shade of red. But I did not stop. I placed the torn halves together and ripped them again, and again. I slowly and methodically shredded the fraudulent contract into dozens of tiny, useless pieces right in front of their faces. I dropped the shredded pieces of the fraudulent contract directly onto the polished mahogany surface of his desk. My father was so utterly stunned by my defiance that he could not even form a coherent sentence. His mouth opened and closed in complete shock. My mother stood frozen in the corner, her hands trembling while Chloe stared at the torn paper like she had just witnessed a murder. I did not wait for any of them to recover their senses. I turned my back on my family, walked straight out of that suffocating office, out the front door, and got into my decoy sedan. I drove away from their fake suburban castle, leaving them to drown in the reality of their own financial ruin. That night, a heavy thunderstorm rolled through the city of Atlanta. I was sleeping peacefully in my penthouse when my private cell phone vibrated violently on my nightstand. The illuminated clock read 2 in the morning. I answered the call, instantly awake. It was Harrison, my director of security. His voice was completely calm, but it carried the sharp edge of a professional who had just found a threat. He told me to open the secure application on my tablet immediately. There had been an incident in the overflow parking lot of my residential building, the exact spot where I parked my mid-range decoy vehicle to keep up my cover. I sat up in bed, swiping my screen to access the live feed. Harrison had pulled the dark, grainy night vision footage from the exterior building cameras. The video was slightly shaky due to the heavy rain and wind, but the scene was undeniably clear. A man dressed in a dark hooded sweatshirt and a medical mask was standing right next to my car. He was holding a heavy metal baseball bat. Without any hesitation, the man raised the bat and brought it down violently against the center of my windshield. The thick safety glass shattered instantly, spiderwebbing into thousands of tiny white fractures under the glaring glow of the streetlights. The thug hit the hood twice more, leaving massive dents in the metal, before throwing a crumpled piece of paper through the broken glass and sprinting away into the dark alley. Harrison stayed on the line while I watched the destruction. He told me his night team had already secured the vehicle and retrieved the note. He read the messy handwriting aloud to me over the phone. The note simply said, "You need to listen to your family before you lose everything." A cold, dangerous calm washed over my entire body. Bradley had actually escalated to physical violence. He was terrified. He knew his fraudulent house of cards was collapsing, and because I had refused to sign the loan that afternoon, he was resorting to cheap intimidation tactics. He thought smashing the windshield of a $30,000 car would break my spirit. He had absolutely no idea that I could buy the entire dealership in cash tomorrow morning if I wanted to. I instructed Harrison to leave the car exactly where it was and to use his private resources to track down the man in the hoodie. I did not want the local police involved yet. I wanted total control over the board. The next morning, I arrived at my corporate headquarters feeling completely energized. The storm had passed, leaving the city looking washed and bright. I walked into my office ready to finalize the trap for the baby shower. But my executive assistant Maya was already waiting for me by my desk. She looked incredibly uncomfortable holding her digital tablet tightly against her chest. She apologized for interrupting my morning routine, but explained that there was a highly unusual situation regarding the corporate complaint hotline. Elite Care maintains a strict customer service line to ensure our high-profile clients receive immediate attention. Maya explained that a man had called the hotline exactly at 8 in the morning, right when the phone lines opened. He had demanded to speak to the regional manager, claiming he had urgent, highly sensitive information about one of our employees. He had specifically named me. I smiled, gesturing for Maya to sit down. I told her to play the audio recording of the call. Maya tapped her screen, and the unmistakable, arrogant voice of my brother-in-law filled my office. Bradley was using his most authoritative, condescending corporate tone. He introduced himself using a fake name, claiming to be a prominent local business owner. He told the customer service representative that he felt it was his moral duty to warn the company about Nia Carter. I sat back in my leather chair, listening to this desperate man try to ruin my life. Bradley spun a massive, disgusting web of lies. He claimed that I had recently been caught stealing expensive jewelry from my own family members to pay off secret gambling debts. He warned the representative that I was emotionally unstable, deeply bitter, and completely unfit to work around children or handle any sensitive client information. He used his thickest layer of white privilege speaking to the elite care operator as if he was a superior commanding a subordinate. He practically demanded that the company terminate my employment immediately to avoid a massive public relations scandal. He actually said, "A luxury brand like yours cannot afford to have a volatile thief like Nia answering your phones." The absolute mind-blowing irony of the situation was almost euphoric. Bradley was committing criminal defamation and targeted harassment on a recorded line, calling my own company, demanding that my own employees fire their chief executive officer. He truly believed I was a low-level secretary. He thought he could snap his fingers, make a single phone call, and completely destroy my livelihood. He wanted me broke, unemployed, and terrified, forced to crawl back to my family and beg for a place in Chloe's guest room. Maya stopped the recording, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and deep concern. She assured me that the Human Resources Department knew the accusations were entirely baseless, but they were required by protocol to log the call. She asked me how I wanted to handle this deranged individual. I told Maya to attach the audio file to the Diamond Tier application we had approved for Chloe and Bradley the previous day. I told her the pieces were coming together perfectly and to proceed with scheduling their final interview for Saturday. I dismissed her with a wave of my hand, feeling an immense wave of satisfaction. Just as Maya closed the door behind her, my private office line rang. It was Harrison. He did not bother with a greeting. He simply told me he had the package. Harrison explained that the thug from the parking lot was a local amateur, a petty criminal with a lengthy record of minor offenses. My security team had tracked the license plate of the getaway car from a nearby traffic camera. They had intercepted the man at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city less than an hour ago. Harrison said he did not even have to threaten the guy. The moment his security team cornered him and showed him the high-definition night vision footage, the thug completely panicked. He flipped immediately. Harrison reported his voice devoid of any sympathy. The guy did not want to go back to county jail for property damage and extortion. He spilled everything right on the hood of his car. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. I asked Harrison exactly what the man had confessed. Harrison let out a low chuckle. He said a wealthy white guy in a tailored suit paid him $500 in cash in the back of a country club parking lot to smash your windshield. The guy gave him your exact address and handed him the threatening note in a sealed envelope. The thug even took a picture of the license plate on the guy's luxury SUV just in case the deal went bad. We ran the plates, Nia. The car belongs to Bradley. We have the thug on a sworn recorded video statement explicitly naming your brother-in-law as the mastermind behind the vandalism and the extortion attempt. I closed my eyes, letting the sheer perfection of the moment wash over me. Bradley had dug his grave, built his own coffin, and just handed me the hammer to nail it shut. The trap was now inescapable. With Bradley's physical threats completely neutralized and his recorded confession securely locked in my corporate vault, my focus shifted entirely to the ultimate prize. Bradley was going to federal prison, but my parents required a completely different kind of justice. They had attempted to use my grandmother's legacy as a weapon to force me into a life of servitude. They had lied to my face, pretending to be wealthy benefactors, offering me a piece of a house they had already secretly lost to the bank. It was time to show them exactly what real generational wealth looked like. I left my corner office and walked down the glass corridor to the primary executive boardroom. The heavy mahogany doors swung open, revealing a room designed specifically for massive corporate takeovers. I took my seat at the very head of the long, polished table. Sitting strategically down the sides of the table were three of the most ruthless, high-priced senior attorneys in the city. I had a shark from corporate litigation, a master of asset management, and a senior partner specializing entirely in aggressive real estate acquisitions. The atmosphere in the room was intensely focused. There were no fake tears here. There was no emotional manipulation. There was only cold, hard, undeniable financial strategy. I looked at my lead real estate attorney, a sharp woman named Evelyn, and asked for the final status report on the residential property located in the Alpharetta suburbs. This was not just any property. This was Grandma Dorothy's historic estate. It was the only place in the world where I had ever felt truly safe as a child. While my parents were busy parading Chloe around country clubs and ignoring me, my grandmother used to sit with me on that massive wraparound porch. She was the one who taught me how to read financial ledgers. She was the one who told me I was brilliant, capable, and meant for a life far beyond the shallow expectations of my mother. When she died, my father, Marcus, abused his power as the legal executor to steal that sanctuary. He took out a massive predatory second mortgage on the paid-off estate just to fund Chloe's ridiculous fairy tale wedding and buy Bradley a luxury vehicle. He desecrated the only pure thing my family had left. Evelyn slid a thick, meticulously organized binder across the mahogany table toward me. She reported that my father was completely delusional about his financial standing. He had taken out a high-interest variable rate loan from a highly aggressive commercial lender. Because he and my mother were obsessed with maintaining their wealthy country club facade, they had completely depleted their savings. According to the bank's internal records, my parents were currently 120 days past due on their mortgage payments. The commercial bank had already initiated the pre-foreclosure process. In less than 2 weeks, the bank was going to publicly auction the historic estate to the highest bidder, and my parents were going to be forcibly removed by the county sheriff. Marcus thought he was incredibly clever. He knew the bank was closing in, which is exactly why he tried to force me to sign that fraudulent $100,000 promissory note in his home office. He wanted to use my pristine credit to secure a bailout loan, using a fake inheritance as the bait. I opened the binder and looked at the mountain of legal documents. I asked Evelyn if our quiet acquisition had been fully finalized. A sharp, victorious smile appeared on Evelyn's face. She confirmed that it was absolutely complete. Commercial lenders do not care about family drama. They only care about liquid capital and minimizing their toxic assets. My attorneys had approached the bank through a blind corporate shell company entirely owned by me. We offered to purchase the defaulted mortgage note and the deed of trust directly from the bank, paying the entire outstanding balance in pure untraceable cash. The bank was absolutely thrilled to offload the bad debt without having to go through a messy, expensive public auction. Evelyn pointed to the final page in the binder. The ink on the transfer documents was completely dry. The transaction was officially registered with the county clerk that very morning. The reality of the legal maneuver settled over the boardroom like a heavy, magnificent weight. I did not just pay off my parents' debt to save them. I bought the debt. I purchased the promissory note. That meant the commercial bank was no longer in charge of the property. I was. I looked at the 3 senior lawyers sitting around me. I was now legally the sole lien holder of the estate. I was the bank. I was the landlord. And my parents, who had spent my entire life treating me like an unwanted burden, were now officially my delinquent tenants. They were living in a house they did not own, sleeping under a roof that I exclusively controlled. My corporate litigator spoke up next. He explained the exact timeline of our newly acquired rights. Because my parents were already 4 months in default under the original terms of the loan, the grace period was completely non-existent. The legal right to initiate an immediate eviction and assume total possession of the property was absolute. We did not need to wait for a court date. We did not need to negotiate a settlement. By ripping up that fraudulent contract in his office, I had unknowingly saved myself from being tied to their sinking ship, and instead I had just bought the entire ocean they were drowning in. I sat back in my plush leather chair, looking out the boardroom window at the sprawling city. I thought about my mother throwing that diaper bag at my feet. I thought about my father demanding I stand up in a church and apologize for my barrenness. I thought about Chloe mocking my apartment and telling me I belonged sweeping floors. They had built their entire identities on the illusion of superiority. They derived their power from making me feel small. It was finally time to strip that illusion away and leave them with absolutely nothing but the truth. I turned back to the table and gave my legal team their final instructions. I told Evelyn to draft the official notice to vacate. I did not want a standard 30-day warning. I wanted the most aggressive, legally binding, immediate eviction notice the state of Georgia allowed for a severely defaulted commercial property. The room was completely silent, except for the rhythmic, heavy hum of the high-grade laser printer in the corner of the boardroom. The machine processed the command, and a moment later, it spit out a stack of crisp, white legal documents. Evelyn retrieved the papers and placed them squarely in front of me. At the very top, printed in bold, undeniable black letters, were the words, "Notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction." I picked up my favorite gold fountain pen. The metal felt perfectly heavy and balanced in my hand. I signed my full legal name at the bottom of the authorization line, pressing the ink deeply into the paper. With that single signature, I effectively rendered my parents totally and completely homeless. Evelyn carefully gathered the signed documents and placed them into a thick red legal folder. She asked me when I wanted the process servers to deliver the eviction notice to the Alpharetta property. She noted that we could have the county sheriff posted on their front door by tomorrow morning. I shook my head slowly, my eyes locked on the red folder. I told her that sending a process server to an empty house on a Friday morning lacked a certain level of poetic justice. My family cared about nothing more than their public image. Their entire existence revolved around the opinions of their wealthy neighbors, their church congregation, and Chloe's elite social circle. If they were going to lose everything, they were going to lose it in front of the exact audience they had spent 3 years trying to impress. I instructed Evelyn to hire a private, highly visible team of professional legal couriers. I gave her the exact address of the exclusive suburban country club where my sister was hosting her massive baby shower. I told her the eviction notice was to be served publicly directly into my father's hands on Saturday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. That was the exact same time I was scheduled to arrive at the country club to conduct the final Diamond Tier nanny interview for Chloe and Bradley. The trap was now perfectly, beautifully set. Every single thread of their deception was pulled tight, waiting for the exact moment to snap. They were expecting a quiet, submissive sister to show up and beg for scraps. They were expecting to hire a luxury servant using stolen charity funds. They were expecting to celebrate their fake wealth surrounded by their fake friends. Instead, they were going to face the founder and chief executive officer of the company they were trying to defraud. They were going to face the federal authorities they had provoked. And they were going to face the ruthless landlord who now owned their entire lives. The next morning, the heavy glass doors of my corporate headquarters closed behind me. I walked out into the busy downtown streets of Atlanta. The morning sun was bright, casting long shadows across the pavement as I made my way toward the towering, heavily fortified federal building just 3 blocks away. My tailored trench coat caught the wind, and my heels clicked with absolute purpose against the concrete. I was carrying a sleek, locked leather briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the complete destruction of Bradley and his entire fraudulent empire. I walked past the concrete barricades and approached the heavy security checkpoints of the local Federal Bureau of Investigation field office. I placed my briefcase on the scanning belt, cleared the metal detectors, and was immediately escorted up to the 7th floor. The atmosphere in the federal building was stark, clinical, and completely devoid of the luxury I was accustomed to. There were no mahogany desks or expensive views. There were only gray walls, fluorescent lights, and the heavy weight of federal law. I was guided into a small, windowless interview room. Waiting for me at the metal table was Special Agent Reynolds, a seasoned veteran of the White-Collar Crimes Division, along with Detective Vance, the local financial investigator, who had initially called me about the credit card debt. They stood up and shook my hand respectfully as I entered. They knew exactly who I was. My corporate security director had already briefed their superiors on the massive scale of the evidence I was bringing in. I took my seat across from the 2 federal agents. I unlocked my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy, gold-colored folder. I placed it squarely in the middle of the cold metal table. I told them that this folder contained everything they needed to put a very dangerous, highly manipulative financial predator behind bars for a very long time. Special Agent Reynolds opened the folder and began carefully reviewing the documents. I walked them through the evidence piece by piece, building an inescapable cage around my brother-in-law. First, I presented the identity theft packet. I showed them the original Platinum credit card applications, highlighting the exact date and timestamps. I provided the digital footprint proving the applications were submitted from the Internet Protocol address registered to Chloe's suburban home. I showed them the forged signatures and the $80,000 in defaulted debt that Bradley had deliberately attached to my Social Security number to fund his fake lifestyle. Detective Vance nodded, noting that identity theft was a solid local felony, but what I had next elevated the entire situation to a massive federal level. I pulled out the financial records for the Bright Futures Children's Charity. I placed the routing numbers, the corporate tax filings, and the Elite Care Nanny applications side by side on the table. I explained exactly how Bradley had set up a fake nonprofit organization to solicit generous donations from wealthy church members and country club elites. I showed the agents how he was actively attempting to wire $15,000 of that untaxed charity money across state lines to hire a luxury nanny for his own personal use. Special Agent Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes scanning the wire transfer requests. The moment a suspect uses charitable funds for personal enrichment and processes the transaction through a digital banking network, it becomes federal wire fraud and money laundering. Reynolds confirmed that these charges alone carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. But I was not finished. I reached into the golden folder and pulled out a secure digital drive. I slid it across the table and told them it contained 2 very specific audio and video files. I explained that the first file was a crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording taken just days ago in a church parking lot. I told them they would hear Bradley explicitly confessing to stealing my identity because he needed the capital. They would also hear him committing textbook extortion, threatening to sabotage my career, and have me fired from my job if I did not completely submit to his financial demands and drop the fraud investigation. Then I described the second file on the drive. It was the sworn recorded video confession from the thug Bradley had hired to smash my car windshield. I provided the thug's full name, his criminal record, and the exact location where my corporate security team had intercepted him. I explained that the thug had explicitly named Bradley as the mastermind who paid him $500 in cash to commit the vandalism and deliver a threatening physical note. The interview room was completely silent for a long moment. Special Agent Reynolds closed the golden folder, resting his hands heavily on top of it. He looked at me with a mixture of profound professional respect and slight disbelief. He told me that in his 20 years of working federal financial crimes, he had rarely seen a civilian victim build such a comprehensive, airtight case against their own abuser. He said most victims of family fraud are too manipulated or too ashamed to fight back. I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him I was not a victim. I was the consequence. Reynolds turned to Detective Vance and confirmed that they had more than enough probable cause. With the wire fraud, the charity embezzlement, the extortion, and the witness tampering, Bradley was looking at decades in federal prison. Reynolds stated that he would take the golden folder directly to a federal judge that afternoon. He promised me they would have a signed, sealed arrest warrant by the end of the day. He then outlined his tactical plan. He said the Bureau usually prefers to conduct white-collar arrests early in the morning to prevent the suspect from fleeing or destroying digital evidence. He told me they would assemble a raid team and hit Bradley's corporate brokerage office at 6 o'clock on Friday morning. They would secure his computers, freeze his bank accounts, and parade him out of his lobby in handcuffs. It was a standard, highly effective law enforcement strategy, but it was not what I wanted. I raised my hand, gently interrupting the special agent. I told him that raiding Bradley's office on a quiet Friday morning would be a massive mistake. Reynolds frowned, asking me to explain my reasoning. I kept my voice completely calm and entirely analytical. I explained that Bradley was a highly connected financial broker who spent his entire life manipulating the people around him. If they arrested him quietly at his office, his wealthy friends and his expensive defense attorneys would immediately start spinning the narrative. They would claim it was a massive misunderstanding. Chloe would play the role of the tragic, unsuspecting pregnant wife. My parents would rally the church community to raise bail money and paint me as the villain who framed an innocent man out of pure jealousy. They would control the story, and they would use their white privilege to minimize the damage to their precious social standing. I told the agents that if they wanted to truly dismantle his criminal network and secure the area they needed to arrest him, when he was completely surrounded by his co-conspirators and his fake charity donors. I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the metal table. I proposed a different timeline. I told them that this Saturday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock, my sister Chloe was hosting a massive, incredibly lavish baby shower at the most exclusive suburban country club in the county. I explained that every single person Bradley had defrauded would be in that room. The wealthy church elders who donated to his fake charity would be drinking his champagne. The relatives who believed his lies about his success would be handing him expensive gifts. He would be at the absolute height of his arrogance, completely unprepared for a federal raid. Furthermore, I added my corporate lawyers had already scheduled a private courier to serve my parents with a commercial eviction notice at that exact same time and location. The entire family structure was going to collapse in a single spectacular moment. If the federal agents walked into that country club, they would not just be arresting a fraudster. They would be pulling the curtain back on a massive, coordinated illusion in front of the exact audience Bradley had stolen money to impress. Special Agent Reynolds looked at Detective Vance, then back at me. A slow, approving realization dawned on his face. He recognized the tactical advantage of cornering a suspect in a highly public enclosed space where he could not destroy evidence or quietly deny the charges to his victims. Reynolds tapped his fingers against the golden folder. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to turn my sister's baby shower into a federal crime scene. I stood up from the metal table, buttoning my tailored trench coat. I looked down at the federal agents. I told them my sister was not having a baby shower. She was hosting a crime syndicate masquerading as a family. I thanked them for their time, picked up my empty leather briefcase, and walked out of the interview room. The raid was officially set for Saturday afternoon, and the wolf had absolutely no idea the hunters were already locking the doors. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear blue skies and a bright sun that felt almost like a spotlight waiting for the main event. I stood in the massive walk-in closet of my penthouse, completely shedding the fabricated identity I had worn for years, just to appease my family. There would be no cheap flats today. There would be no oversized, faded sweaters designed to make me look small and insignificant. I reached for a perfectly tailored, deep emerald Tom Ford power suit. The fabric fell flawlessly, projecting absolute authority. I slipped my feet into genuine designer heels that echoed with a sharp, commanding authority on the hardwood floor. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, immaculate style. Finally, I fastened my heavy gold Rolex around my wrist. It was not just a watch. It was a statement of undeniable self-made wealth. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The frightened, compliant daughter was completely gone. In her place stood a chief executive officer ready to collect her debts. I did not take the modest decoy sedan. I took the elevator down to the private garage and unlocked my pristine, custom-ordered black Porsche. The engine roared to life, a deep and powerful sound that perfectly matched my mood. The drive to the exclusive suburban country club took exactly 40 minutes. When I pulled up to the grand columned entrance, the valet attendants immediately stood taller. They were used to seeing expensive cars, but they were not used to seeing me driving one. I handed the keys to the head valet, tipped him a crisp $100 bill, and walked up the wide marble steps toward the main ballroom. The heavy, ornate double doors of the grand ballroom were wide open, revealing a sickeningly lavish display of completely fabricated wealth. Chloe and Bradley had spared absolutely no expense, or rather they had spared no stolen charity funds. The room was dripping in pastel floral arrangements that must have cost thousands of dollars. There were massive crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, flattering light over a towering 5-tier cake. An elegant string quartet was playing softly in the corner. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos were circulating with silver trays of imported champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with the local elite. The influential church aunties were there wearing their finest hats. My father's wealthy business associates were gathered around the bar. It was a perfectly orchestrated theater of success, built entirely on a foundation of federal fraud and toxic debt. I stepped through the doorway and paused at the top of the short staircase leading down into the ballroom. It felt as though time suddenly slowed down. Every step I took down those carpeted stairs was deliberate and powerful. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels seemed to cut through the soft music and the polite chatter. The transformation was so jarring, so completely opposed to the narrative my family had sold them, that people literally stopped talking mid-sentence. Heads began to turn. The whispers started instantly rippling through the crowd like a sudden wave. The church aunties who had looked at me with such deep pity and disgust just last Sunday were now staring at me with wide, shocked eyes. They looked at the immaculate cut of my suit. They looked at the heavy gold watch gleaming on my wrist. They could not comprehend what they were seeing. The narrative they had been fed about the poor, bitter, broke older sister was entirely incompatible with the striking, powerful woman walking through the center of the room. My mother Patricia spotted me from across the room. She was standing with a group of wealthy country club wives holding a crystal flute of champagne. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the blood completely drained from her face. She excused herself abruptly and began practically sprinting across the polished dance floor to intercept me before I could reach the center of the room. She looked absolutely terrified, desperately trying to maintain her perfectly composed smile for the guests, while her eyes flashed with pure, unadulterated panic. She grabbed my arm forcefully, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of my suit. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice a frantic, breathy whisper. "Why are you dressed like this? Did you max out a credit card just to come here and try to upstage your sister on her special day? You are embarrassing us in front of all these important people." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply looked at her with such intense cold authority that she instinctively loosened her grip. I told her I was invited to a final interview and I always dress appropriately for business. Before she could even try to decipher what that meant, Bradley and Chloe materialized through the crowd. Chloe was wearing a custom maternity gown that cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage payment. She looked at my clothes, her face twisting into a mask of deep jealousy and confusion. She had expected me to show up in rags, ready to beg for the live and nanny position. Bradley stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest, completely blinded by his own arrogance. He looked me up and down, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. He noticed the Rolex, but his massive ego immediately convinced him it had to be a cheap imitation. "Well, look who finally decided to show up." Bradley scoffed loudly, ensuring the nearby guests could hear his condescending tone. "What is this, Nia? Did you go to a pawn shop and rent a suit? Did you come here to beg for a job after I made that phone call to your boss? I told you I could ruin your little life, and here you are crawling back to us. If you apologize right now in front of everyone, maybe Chloe and I will still let you wipe our child's nose for minimum wage." He laughed, a harsh grating sound that made my skin crawl. He was standing there holding a glass of champagne paid for by money he stole from poor children, completely convinced he was the most powerful man in the room. He thought he had completely broken me. I did not argue with him. I did not defend my clothes, and I did not correct his incredibly stupid assumptions. I simply let him enjoy his final few seconds of absolute delusion. I looked past his shoulder toward the back of the massive ballroom. My executive assistant, Maya, had just entered through the service doors. She was dressed in a sharp black blazer, holding her digital tablet. She caught my eye and gave me a single firm nod. The audio-visual equipment was connected. The secure files were loaded. I looked back at Bradley, then at Chloe, and finally at my mother. I gave them a bright, perfectly serene smile that made all three of them physically flinch. I told them I did not come here to beg for a job. I came here to conduct a performance review. Without waiting for their response, I smoothly sidestepped Bradley and walked directly toward the raised platform at the front of the room where the string quartet had just finished their song. The DJ, who was hired to make the official announcements, was standing behind his soundboard. He looked slightly confused as I approached, but the sheer authority radiating from my presence stopped him from saying a word. I reached out and calmly took the wireless microphone directly from his hand. I turned around to face the massive room of wealthy guests. The entire ballroom fell completely painfully silent. Every single eye was glued to me. My family was standing frozen in the middle of the dance floor, suddenly realizing they had entirely lost control of the narrative. I looked to the back of the room and signaled Maya with a slight nod. She tapped the screen of her tablet, and the massive projector screen behind me hummed to life, bathing the entire room in a bright, unforgiving light. The massive projector screen behind me illuminated the entire ballroom with the crisp silver crest of Elite Care. The logo was massive, spanning 10 feet across the wall behind me, casting a cool, authoritative glow over the stunned audience. I raised the microphone to my mouth, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable clarity over the silent crowd. "Good afternoon, everyone." I began, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the faces of the wealthy elite, the judgmental church aunties, and finally resting directly on my sister. I know many of you have been eagerly listening to Chloe brag all week about her latest luxury acquisition. She has been telling anyone who would listen that she and her husband Bradley just hired an exclusive $15,000 a month live-in nanny from the most prestigious agency in the state of Georgia. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several of Chloe's closest friends nodded, having clearly heard the arrogant boast multiple times that very afternoon. Well, I am here today to officially deliver the results of their final corporate background interview. I continued pacing slowly across the raised platform. I gave Maya another slight nod. The screen behind me shifted instantly. The Elite Care logo dissolved and was replaced by a massive high-definition screenshot of Chloe's Diamond Tier nanny application. But stamped diagonally across the personal document in bright, glaring red letters was the word denied. I watched the exact moment the color completely drained from Chloe's face. Her smug, confident expression shattered instantly, replaced by a pale, hollow look of absolute terror. Her eyes darted frantically around the room. She took a stumbling step backward, clutching the fabric of her expensive maternity gown. Bradley stood frozen right beside her, his jaw completely slack, his eyes fixed on the massive screen displaying his personal financial information to his entire social circle. Unfortunately, Chloe and Bradley's application for our premium services was severely flagged by our financial security division, I announced, projecting my voice to ensure it cut entirely through the rising whispers of the ballroom. You see, Elite Care requires our high net worth clients to use legitimate, verifiable personal or corporate funds. But Bradley attempted to pay the $30,000 initial retainer using a routing number attached to a nonprofit organization called the Bright Futures Children's Charity. The collective gasp that erupted from the crowd was absolutely deafening. It was not just shock. It was immediate visceral anger. Several prominent church elders, men who I knew for a fact had written massive donation checks to that exact charity just last month, immediately stood up from their tables. The wealthy local investors Bradley played golf with began shouting angry questions, their faces turning a deep, furious red with the sudden realization that they had been conned. That is exactly right, I said, my voice commanding total attention over the rising chaos. Bradley set up a fake charity. He took your generous donations money that was explicitly promised to support underprivileged youth here in Atlanta, and he attempted to use those tax-free funds to hire a luxury servant to wait on his wife hand and foot. He has been using your good faith to fund his fake lifestyle. It is a textbook case of federal wire fraud and money laundering. Bradley finally snapped out of his paralyzing shock. His survival instinct kicked in, but it was sloppy and desperate. He lunged forward, his face twisted in a panic so severe he looked completely deranged. "Turn that screen off right now," he screamed, pointing a trembling, furious finger at me. "She is lying. Do not listen to her. This is a massive lie. She is just a jealous, broke secretary who forged these fake documents to ruin my family because she is mentally unstable. She does not even work for that company. She lives in a tiny apartment. She is nobody." He turned around, holding his hands up to his wealthy friends, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. "The charity is completely legitimate," Bradley pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "We are just restructuring the financial accounts." She hacked into my computer to frame me. I smiled. It was the moment I had been waiting for my entire life. I looked directly at Bradley, watching him squirm in the trap he built for himself. Then I shifted my gaze to my mother, Patricia. She was standing perfectly still on the polished dance floor, her crystal champagne flute shaking violently in her trembling hand. "That is where you are completely wrong, Bradley," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal calm that carried effortlessly through the speakers. "I did not forge anything, and I certainly did not hack into your computer. I pulled this official application directly from my own secure corporate server." I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch just long enough to make them absolutely agonize over what I was about to say next. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Elite Care." If the first revelation caused a gasp, this one caused an absolute earthquake. The entire ballroom erupted into total chaos. The church aunties, the very women who had publicly humiliated me last Sunday at my mother's explicit request, were staring at me as if I had just descended from the sky. They looked at the immaculate cut of my tailored Tom Ford suit. They looked at the heavy gold Rolex gleaming under the chandelier lights. And then they looked directly at my mother, who had spent the last 5 years spinning a pathetic, highly detailed narrative about my supposed poverty and professional failure. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but absolutely nothing came out. The crystal champagne flute finally slipped from her paralyzed fingers. It hit the polished wooden dance floor and shattered into dozens of sharp, glittering pieces. The sharp crash echoed loudly, but she did not even flinch. She was entirely, completely speechless. Her entire social standing, the fake empire of superiority she had built by stepping on my neck and elevating Chloe, was completely obliterated in front of her prestigious country club peers. Everyone in the room now knew she was a liar who covered up for a thief. Chloe burst into frantic, hysterical tears. "It is not true," she wailed, grabbing Bradley's arm and shaking him violently. "She is making it all up to ruin my baby shower. Make her stop, Daddy. Tell them she is lying. Make her stop right now." My father Marcus had been standing near the private bar, watching his entire carefully curated legacy burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. He realized that the wealthy businessmen he spent his weekends desperately trying to impress were currently looking at him with absolute, undeniable disgust. He realized his perfect son-in-law was a federal criminal, and worse, his massive ego realized that the daughter he had treated like a worthless, disposable burden was actually a wildly successful corporate millionaire who had completely outsmarted all of them. His narcissistic rage completely took over. He could not handle the public humiliation of losing his absolute control. He pushed his way violently through the crowd of whispering guests, his face a violent shade of purple. He marched right up to the very edge of the stage, looking up at me with eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You ungrateful, vindictive little snake!" Marcus roared, his deep voice booming so loudly it rivaled the sound system. "You come into this private club, you insult your pregnant sister on the happiest day of her life, and you try to destroy my family with these ridiculous corporate lies. I do not care what kind of fake company you claim to run. You are completely done in this family." He pointed a massive, threatening finger at me, leaning into his patriarchal authority, one final desperate time. He thought he still had the ultimate leverage over my life. He thought he still held the keys to the only thing I genuinely cared about. "I am the sole legal executor of your grandmother's estate," Marcus screamed, making absolutely sure the entire ballroom heard his harsh punishment. "And as of this exact second, you are permanently banished from this family. You will never step foot inside Dorothy's house ever again. I am calling my lawyers and legally rewriting the deed tomorrow morning. You are cut off entirely. You get absolutely nothing." He stood there, his chest heaving with exertion, fully expecting me to shrink back in fear. He expected me to drop the microphone, burst into apologetic tears, and beg for my inheritance just like he had conditioned me to do since I was a teenager. He wanted me to cower in front of his wealthy friends to repair his broken pride. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound was so relaxed, so completely devoid of any fear or submission, that it made Marcus visibly stumble back half a step. I looked down at my father, the man who had gladly traded his own daughter's emotional well-being for a country club membership and a fake image of success. I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out the crisp, heavy red legal folder my real estate attorney had given me the day before. The entire room held its collective breath, sensing the massive shift in power. I had successfully destroyed Bradley and completely exposed Chloe. But I was not done yet. I was about to drop the second bomb, and it was going to wipe my parents completely off the map. I stepped down from the raised platform, the heavy red folder firmly in my grip. The crowd parted for me once again, but this time they were completely silent, watching me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. I walked directly over to the massive gift table at the edge of the dance floor. It was piled high with expensive baby gifts, wrapped in designer paper and tied with silk ribbons, all paid for by the very people my brother-in-law had actively defrauded. I looked back at my father, whose chest was still heaving with his misguided patriarchal rage. He truly believed he possessed the ultimate weapon to destroy my life. He believed banishing me from my grandmother's house would finally bring me to my knees. I raised the microphone and locked my eyes directly onto his. "You threatened to banish me from Dorothy's house," I said, my voice echoing coldly off the crystal chandeliers above us. "You stood there just 5 seconds ago and threatened to cut me out of a will that does not even exist anymore. Did you really think I was that incredibly stupid, Marcus? Did you honestly believe I would not find out what you did?" I opened the heavy red folder and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. I slammed them down onto the gift table right on top of a massive pile of expensive presents. The sharp smack of the paper hitting the table made my mother physically jump in fear. "You do not own that house," I announced to the entire ballroom, letting the brutal truth ring out. 3 years ago, when your precious golden child Chloe demanded a massive 6-figure fairy tale wedding, you did not have the cash. You were completely broke, so you abused your legal power of attorney. You went behind the backs of everyone in this family and took out a massive high-interest commercial mortgage on my grandmother's fully paid-off estate. You bled her legacy entirely dry just to buy imported flowers and put a down payment on Bradley's luxury vehicle. My father's face went from a violent shade of purple to a sickly pale white in less than a second. His mouth opened, but his booming voice had completely abandoned him. The wealthy men he played golf with were now staring at him in utter disbelief. He was exposed not just as a liar, but as a complete financial failure. "And because you are a financial failure," I continued, showing absolutely no mercy, "you defaulted on that massive loan. You are 4 months past due." The commercial bank was preparing to foreclose on the property next week. They were going to throw you and Patricia out onto the street and auction my grandmother's house to the highest bidder. That is exactly why you tried to force me to sign that fraudulent loan document in your home office. You desperately needed my pristine credit score to save yourselves from total financial ruin. I walked a few steps closer to him, letting a cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. I watched his entire foundation crumble before my very eyes. "But you made a massive miscalculation, Marcus. I did not sign your fraudulent loan. Instead, my corporate real estate attorneys contacted your commercial lender. I used my own liquid capital to buy your toxic debt directly from the bank. I purchased the promissory note. I purchased the deed of trust." I pointed a single perfectly manicured finger directly at his chest. "You are no longer the legal executor of that estate. I am the sole lien holder. I am your bank. I am your landlord. You are currently living under my roof and you are standing on my property." My father staggered backward as if I had physically struck him in the chest. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of the nearest cocktail table just to keep himself from collapsing completely onto the polished wooden floor. The towering, arrogant patriarch was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, bankrupt old man who had just lost his home, his reputation, and his favorite child in front of his entire country club audience. I reached back into the red folder and pulled out a single sheet of crisp white paper printed with bold black letters. I tossed it lightly through the air. It fluttered down and landed directly at his expensive leather shoes. "And since you are 4 months delinquent on your payments to me," I said quietly into the microphone, "that piece of paper by your feet is your official legally binding eviction notice. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property." The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the ragged, panicked breathing of my mother standing 10 feet away. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to say a single word. I had completely dismantled them. I had stripped away every single lie, every single ounce of unearned privilege, and left them with absolutely nothing. I looked at Bradley, who was still frozen in shock near the stage. I looked at Chloe, who was sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. I looked at my parents, whose lives were now officially over. I lowered the microphone and turned to walk out of the ballroom. But before I could even take my first step toward the grand double doors, a new sound shattered the heavy silence of the country club. It started as a faint wail in the distance and rapidly grew into a deafening, terrifying roar. Heavy, aggressive police sirens wailed from the main road, accompanied by the loud screech of heavy tires tearing up the manicured gravel driveway right outside the venue. The heavy double doors of the grand ballroom burst open with such violent force that they slammed loudly against the walls. The chaotic flashing of red and blue lights spilled into the elegant room, reflecting blindingly off the crystal chandeliers overhead. A highly coordinated team of federal agents wearing dark tactical vests, emblazoned with the letters FBI, stormed into the venue, followed closely by a dozen local law enforcement officers. The elegant string quartet abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The wealthy guests gasped in collective horror, scrambling backward and dropping their expensive crystal champagne glasses as the armed agents fanned out rapidly across the polished dance floor. The atmosphere instantly shifted from a lavish celebration to a scene of absolute terrifying chaos. Special Agent Reynolds marched directly to the front of the room, his sharp eyes scanning the panicked crowd before locking dead onto Bradley. Bradley immediately tried to deploy the only defense mechanism he had ever known. He puffed up his chest, smoothing his expensive jacket, and stepped forward with his hands raised in righteous indignation. He shouted aggressively at the federal agents, demanding to know what they thought they were doing. He explicitly reminded them that this was a highly exclusive private country club, dropping the name of the local chief of police as if it were a magic spell. He expected his tailored suit, his wealth, and his skin color to act as an impenetrable shield. He truly, deeply believed he could simply talk his way out of a federal raid using sheer privilege. Agent Reynolds did not even break his stride. He grabbed Bradley violently by the shoulder, spun him around roughly, and slammed him chest first onto the nearest cocktail table. The beautiful floral arrangements crashed to the hardwood floor in a mess of water and shattered glass. Bradley let out a sharp gasp of shock as the cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly shut around his wrists. Reynolds leaned in, his voice booming with undeniable authority so that every single wealthy investor and church elder in the room could hear his exact words. "Bradley, you are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and the severe embezzlement of charitable funds." The words hung in the humid air of the ballroom like a heavy death sentence. The pristine illusion of the successful elite financial broker was completely shattered in front of his peers. The wealthy businessmen who had respected him were now staring at him like he was a diseased animal. The church aunties who had praised his godly character were whispering to each other in absolute nauseating horror. The invisible shield of white privilege that Bradley had used to belittle me, to extort me, and to navigate the world without facing a single consequence had just been completely obliterated by the full, crushing weight of the federal government. As the agents yanked him upright, the arrogant, condescending predator vanished completely. Bradley broke down. His legs turned to jelly, his knees buckling so severely the federal agents had to physically hold him up by his armpits. He began sobbing uncontrollably, his chest heaving, heavy tears streaming down his flushed face and soaking the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He looked incredibly small and utterly pathetic. Desperate for any possible lifeline, his frantic, tear-filled eyes locked onto me. The same man who had hurled racial slurs at me and threatened to render me unemployable just days ago was now openly weeping like a terrified child. "Nia, please," he screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he fought weakly against the agents. "Tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. You have the money, Nia. Please call your lawyers. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I will do whatever you want. Please do not let them take me away." The guests watched in stunned silence as he humiliated himself. Beside him, Chloe descended into absolute unhinged hysteria. The perfect, composed stay-at-home mother lost her mind completely. She dropped to her bare knees on the hardwood floor, screaming at the top of her lungs, blindly grabbing at the federal agents' legs as they began to drag her husband away. She wailed incoherently about her reputation, her country club status, and her ruined life. My parents stood completely frozen in the background, entirely powerless, watching the authorities haul away the golden son-in-law they had literally bankrupted themselves to impress. I stood perfectly still, watching the chaotic, pathetic display of cowardice unfold in front of me. Bradley continued to scream my name, his voice growing hoarse with sheer primal terror as the agents dragged his heavy, limp body toward the grand double doors. He begged for just 1 ounce of the grace, mercy, and family loyalty he had spent his entire life denying me. I looked at his tear-streaked, desperate face one final time. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no remorse, just the cold, intensely satisfying finality of pure justice. I slowly turned my back to him, facing the quiet emptiness of the raised stage, and flatly refused to ever make eye contact with him again. I walked out of the grand ballroom, leaving the chaos and the screaming entirely behind me. I pushed through the heavy front doors of the country club and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The golden hour sun was just beginning to set over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm, brilliant light across the sprawling parking lot. The deep orange rays reflected perfectly off the sleek black hood of my Porsche. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for 31 years was finally permanently gone. I reached out to grab the handle of my car door, but the sound of frantic, stumbling footsteps echoing across the pavement made me pause. "Nia, please wait." I turned around to see my mother, Patricia, running toward me. Her extravagant silk hat was sitting lopsided on her head. Her perfect makeup was completely ruined, running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She was hyperventilating, struggling to catch her breath as she closed the distance between us. She stopped a few feet away, trembling violently, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and absolute desperation. She had just watched her golden son-in-law get dragged away in federal handcuffs. She knew her daughter was deeply complicit in massive financial crimes, and she knew that in exactly 48 hours the county sheriff would be forcibly locking her out of the only home she had left. "Nia, you cannot do this to us," Patricia sobbed, reaching out a shaking hand as if she wanted to grab my arm, but lacking the courage to actually touch me. "We are your family. I am your mother. You cannot just leave us with nothing. We made a mistake, but we can fix this. Please just forgive us." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small. I thought about the days she locked me out of the house. I thought about the time she threw a diaper bag at my feet and commanded me to be a servant. She was only apologizing because the illusion had shattered, and she was the one left sweeping up the broken glass. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute, terrifying calm. "Family protects each other." I told her, my words slicing through the warm evening air. "Family builds each other up. You were never my family. You were just parasites waiting for a host. And I am officially cutting off the supply." I did not wait for her to respond. I pulled open the heavy door of my Porsche and slid into the leather driver's seat. I shut the door firmly, locking her out of my life forever. I started the engine, the powerful roar drowning out the sound of her pathetic weeping. I shifted the car into gear, but before I pulled away, I looked directly into the rearview mirror, locking eyes with you. "They spent my entire life calling me the black sheep," I said, staring straight through the glass. "So I took that disrespect. I built an empire, and I turned myself into the alpha wolf." If you are sitting out there right now letting toxic people drain your energy, your finances, or your joy, under the manipulative guise of blood and family, let this be your sign to cut the cord. You do not owe your abusers your future. Subscribe to my channel and share this video if you have ever had to stand up, walk away, and take your absolute power back. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal and drove away into the sunset, leaving the wreckage entirely in the rearview mirror.